Oh, that's got to be the happiest killer I've ever seen on film. While he's finishing up, the definition of exploitation film is listed as
a film intended to attract an audience by means of sensationalist or controversial content.
For the exploitation horror movie, that usually meant lots of blood, lots of boobs, and lots of sickening bone bashing. Hey, Bud? Bud? I think you got her. Want to take 5? So, without going into an historical deep dive of this genre, exploitation films have existed in varying degrees of shock value since the early days of filmmaking, except what was considered exploitive in 1920 would have been laughable 50 years later in 1970. But we'll stick with the badass era, from the 60s through to the early 80s. They still exist today, mainly made in homage to the Golden Age, but it just doesn't feel the same unless you can walk down to 42nd Street in New York City and watch it in some pea-soaked grindhouse theater, or an independent drive-in theater in rural Texas at 3 a.m. But why do people like these movies? They're low budget, cheap looking, the acting blows goats, and the gore is so over the top that you wonder why they even bother with dialogue. Just have opening credits, show the bloodbath, and then roll end credits. Actually, some of them weren't that bad once you look past the low-hanging fruit. When you study the pacing, cinematography, lighting, angles, you can see some greatness there beyond the extreme violence. And some of these directors, that's how they managed to break into the business, by doing these types of movies. Someone like Wes Craven, whose first movie was the exploitation rape revenge movie, Last House on the Left. And I'm here to tell you, that is a piece of work. Yo. Directors such as Herschel Gordon Lewis made a career out of this kind of genre. Writing, directing, producing, editing, doing pretty much everything except handing out sandwiches at the craft service table. And he made a fortune from it by handing over cinematic gems such as Blood Feast, 2000 Maniacs, and Color Me Blood Red, which all came out in the early to mid-60s. So if you didn't feel like staying home and watching the Beverly Hillbillies or Gilligan's Island, you'd head on down to 42nd Street to the Empire Theater and get a heapin' helping of a slightly different kind of hospitality, which could still be hillbilly style. Into the 70s, you couldn't swing a dead cat without hitting another exploitation subgenre. There were almost too many to even keep track of. My personal favorites were the touching works of Russ Meyer, but that would be for another video. Suffice to say, though, that he also made a shitwad of money. Movies like Cannibal Holocaust and Giallo a Venenza will leave you shaken and staring at the floor and wondering just what in the name of all that is holy did I just see. Dawn of the Dead, which I talk about a lot on this channel, has been reassessed time and again over the years, elevating from just another grindhouse bucket of blood to being considered probably one of the finest horror movies ever made, a watershed achievement in the genre, and more than just a zombie flick. Memorable characters, social commentary, and special effects that would kick ass even by today's standards are just a few of the many reasons you need to own this masterpiece. Movies like I Drink Your Blood and I Spit on Your Grave are staples of the exploitation catalog and must-sees in your immersion efforts. I found it galling that Roger Ebert, the very same who helped pen the big-titted Hitler sex comedy Up with Russ Meyer, would have the audacity, as it were, to call I Spit on Your Grave quite possibly the worst movie ever made. Yeah, sure, Roger. I was looking at the list of 1970s exploitation movies on Wikipedia and was surprised to see that the Amityville Horror was listed there. The only thing that movie exploits is the horrible overacting. It's enough to make your eyeballs want to shit their own pants. The Italians, they know how to party when it comes to making good old-fashioned filthy horror movies. Hell of the Living Dead, Cannibals in the Streets, The Monsters of Florence, and Opera are just a few from the list of zillions that came out in the 80s. But sadly by then, the genre began to wane. Crumbling old grindhouse theaters were torn down and replaced with circuit cities and Walmarts. The rise of home video kept people at home watching Terms of Endearment and Indiana Jones, and censorship and the video nasties made sure anything controversial that came out could only be accessed if you had a pen pal in Snake Alley. But fear not, they kind of came roaring back in the 2000s as a whole new generation of filmmakers watched old Herschel Gordon Lewis movies, and tried to do it better. And if you're into the current indie horror scene, you know that there are some tasteless pieces of shit out there, though will never be classics in the same way as their 1960s counterparts. But will still keep you coming back for that heapin' helpin'.